The pursuit of the truth is often met with deceit, but the quest for liberty always discovers the truth. Hello, I'm Jake with InternetDeputy.com, where it's not about politics, it's about freedom. On Sunday, October 1st, Chris Wallace of the Fox News Sunday interviewed the White House Budget Director Nick Mulvaney.
Republican plan for overhauling the tax code this week, calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity. But there are already serious questions about who benefits from the plan and how much it will add to the deficit. We want to discuss that now with the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Nick Mulvaney. Let's turn to the tax reform plan that the President and Republicans in Congress rolled out this week. The President told Americans who benefits.
By eliminating the tax breaks and special interest loopholes that primarily benefit the wealthy, our framework ensures that the benefits of tax reform go to the middle class, not the highest earners.
But Director Mulvaney, independent experts say what the President just said there isn't true.
What I think that particular organization did was, number one, they didn't do any dynamic scoring. If you go look at the details of what they put out, they assumed no benefit to the overall economy, which is just absurd to think that there won't be any
But I'm not talking,
economic
sir, I'm not
benefit
talking about
to
the
overall
economy. I'm talking about the benefit to the individual
let
family.
me finish.
The tax cut they get.
I got it, but let me go through. You can't look at the tax cut on a family until you realize how much better off they're going to be in a growing economy. But beyond that, they had to make assumptions because we didn't put any in the framework yet about where those particular tax rates kick in. There's nothing in the document yet about that. Not because we're hiding it, but because we're working with Congress to try and establish where the different rates kick in. Keep in mind, there's 4 rates. There's 0% rate, and we know that will go up to $24,000. After that, it's 12, 25, and 35. But there's been absolutely no decisions made yet on where those percentages kick in terms of the tax brackets. It's impossible to do what the National Tax Center just did. So my guess is, and I think that's the one that Jared Bernstein works for, it's not surprising that the former chief economist for a Democrat vice president doesn't like a Republican tax plan.
All right, now let's get to the other issue you were discussing, and I interrupted you, and forgive me for that, and that is the issue of cost, because the Senate Republican budget plan calls for a tax cut that is going to cost the Treasury $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. And some outside experts say that the plan that was unveiled this week actually will add $2 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. But the fact is, there is no evidence that tax cuts pay for themselves. The Reagan tax cut back in 1981 added $208 billion to the deficit over 4 years. The Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 added $1.5 trillion to the debt over 10 years. Mr. Mulvaney, you can argue whether or not tax cuts spur economic growth. I think that's a perfectly legitimate argument. There is no evidence that they pay for themselves.
Well, just look at the facts, and you can go back, Chris, and make an assumption, and you can run some numbers. You have to make a couple of assumptions about growth rates and so forth. But if we had 3% growth, which is what we're trying to get to, and what we're at, by the way, right now, we're trying to maintain that 3% growth. If we had been at 3% growth over the last 10 years, the budget very nearly would be balanced this year. That's how big a difference it makes when you grow the American economy, that additional 1% over 10 years. Over the next 10 years, if we can grow at 3% instead of the 1.8% that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office says that we're going to grow at, and has been the average under the previous administration, if we can get to that 3%, it is $2 to $2.5 trillion worth of more government revenues. It's 12 million additional jobs, and those are 12 million jobs paying into Medicare, 12 million jobs paying into Social Security. Growth really is what's driving all of this.
Wallace asserts that the plan is unfair to the middle class and benefits the wealthy 1%, and that it will cause a federal deficit to go up. All right, these are claims which he bases on a report from the nonpartisan, I say that nonpartisan, Tax Policy Center. The Tax Policy Center has a passive-leaning left, of course. Wallace's claim is erroneous. Well, I should say his claims are erroneous, and that they're based not on fact, but on arbitrary numbers, typical class warfare rhetoric, and bears no comprehension of economics as it pertains to historical data. In other words, it is clear that Wallace is an economic illiterate and has fallen for the leftist arguments that have time and time again been proven false, yet still allowed to dominate the narrative. In truth, according to the budget director, the tax plan has not been worked out entirely. He even went as far as to point out that the media outlets have made opposite allegations of the tax plan than Wallace was making at that time. According to him, the Tax Policy Center could not actually come up to its own conclusions due to the limited data released thus far. So whatever the Tax Policy Center was reporting, they pretty much made up, right? Chris Wallace also showed numbers of deficits that went up under certain presidential administrations that cut tax rate. He claimed that the deficits increased as a result of the cuts, which is a complete fallacy. Unfortunately, Budget Director Nick Mulvaney did not dispute the claim based on the actual historical economic data. The fact is that the deficit and tax cuts are completely separate issues, and relying on the data of budgetary forecasts is arbitrary when taking actual history into account. Sometimes I see people on the media or people who are defending a particular position of theirs who fail to point out some of the basic things. And I don't know whether it's because they just don't understand or whether they're on the spot at that time and they just forget. And I don't really care who it is. I see it all the time. But then again, it's easy to be, an armchair observer watching the things and saying, why didn't you say this or why didn't you say that? But really, clearly, Nick Mulvaney, if he is aware of the historical value of the past where tax cuts are concerned, he should have been on the ball citing these things. But no, instead he went in a little different direction, cited that it would grow the economy and so forth. But in reality, there was true facts that would have set Wallace straight right then and there, and he didn't do it. While tax cuts are shown as deficits on a proposed budget, the reality is the IRS takes in more money than the years prior to their implementations. In other words, if you say I'm going to have, if you're running a business, for example, and you expect you're going to do 2,000 in sales, but then you offer a discount and you end up bringing 3,000 in sales as a result of that discount. This is what happened. What the budget says has nothing to do with what actually occurs. The budget is just a guideline. Indeed, the deficit has gone up with tax cuts present, but it has also been an issue of government spending habits that raise the debt and not the lack of money brought in as a result. Just because the deficit went up and there was a tax cut that same year does not mean that the tax cut caused it. You have to have a cause and effect. Actually, if it weren't for the spending, that tax cut would have brought in, which did bring in revenue, could have been used to pay down the debt. We actually saw this in history in the past, which I'll get to here in a minute. In Wallace's attack of the tax plan, he mentioned that Ronald Reagan administration specifically for raising the debt, claiming that the tax cut added $208 billion to the deficit over 4 years. He also spoke of the Bush tax cuts. His assertion is nothing less than a complete false statement. In fact, both of the Reagan and the Bush administrations brought in substantially higher revenues than previous years. Okay? Again, just because the politicians are spending like drunk sailors on a Saturday night does not mean that it's because the money that came into the drunk sailors was less. All right? The truth of the matter is more money has always been brought in as a result of tax cuts, especially when you do them across the board. All right? 1987 press conference, Ronald Reagan pointed out that the GDP went up as a result of the tax cuts, and so did the tax revenues in the same portions. So if the GDP goes up 3%, then that means that the tax revenues stayed constant at that 3% rise. So in this case, he said that the problem was that the revenue was at a constant of 19% of GDP. So it was 19% of GDP whether there was less or more. In this case, the GDP rose, so there was more. So the 19% of GDP, if GDP goes up, that means that 19% is a substantially higher dollar amount. right? I mean, it's a basic math. Unfortunately, they don't teach basic math in the school system anymore. They have Common Core, which tries to make things so difficult that nobody gets it, and then they all feel stupid together, and then everybody can say kumbaya about it, right? The basic mathematics that apparently nobody gets. The real problem, according to Reagan, is that Congress, now remember, he was receiving 19% of GDP. GDP was going up, which means tax dollar collections were going up. However, Congress was spending at a rate of 23% of that rising GDP. Okay, the words of the former president are backed by recorded empirical data. Thus, when Wallace asserted that the tax cut resulted in a higher deficit, he was completely wrong and simply tying two unrelated actions to one another. Sadly, many Americans will hear this misinformation and take it at face value. In other words, what they're going to hear is, well, if we cut taxes, the deficit's going to rise. No, if you cut taxes, revenues will actually increase. What makes the deficit rise are people spending. Okay? Spending on stupid stuff we don't need, stuff that's not even constitutional. The same holds true with the Bush tax cuts. The tax were a reaction to a slow economy that actually spurred growth and brought in more revenues to the IRS in the previous years. But the reasons for the rising deficit was once again a result of overspending. In this case, it was due to two ongoing wars and the entitlement programs that nobody likes to talk about. They always want to talk about the one thing that is constitutional, that they do finance, which is war. Hello, the protection of the the citizens of the United States of America. But they never want to talk about the entitlement programs that are growing more entitlement programs, right? But the level of Wallace's economic ignorance is indicative of the average public schools and especially college-educated Americans. Americans have been spoon-fed so many false narratives regarding taxes and economics that some refuse to actually review the mountains of empirical data on the subject. Many economists, historians, and researchers have documented this data in numerous books, publications, and documentaries on this matter. So it's not as though the information isn't there. It's just people, many of them apparently college educated, can't take the time to actually research it, or they're, and these are, it's funny because these are the same people that like to say that, they believe in science and, the scientific method and proving things empirically, but then they refuse to look at the empirical data that proves them wrong. That's not science, that's pseudoscience. For example, it was a well-documented fact in the early 1920s that there was a depression that was really never reported about subsequently. It self-corrected itself due to a couple of things. One is, at that time, up until that time, there had never been any government intrusion into the economy. No government intervention to help make it better, which usually makes it worse, right? So basically, the Harding and Cooling administration, upon taking office, faced the end of World War I, whereby thousands of military personnel would be returning to America with the worry of not having jobs, right? So you've got, coming off of the Wilson administration, you have the end of World War I, all these servicemen coming over, and then the big worry was, oh no, and they were going through a depression at that time. You call it a major recession or whatever, but James Grant in his book, he actually calls it, what he thinks it is the forgotten depression. Now, there was a lot of stuff happening. I don't want to go into it. It's a very interesting book if you ever get a chance to read the Forgotten Depression. But there was a lot of stuff happening that we're never told about during that time, that people were worried that, the financial situation that was occurring at that time was not good. It was dismal. So when Warren Harding first took office, it was suggested that his administration create government jobs by building roads across the country for a newfound automobile that had taken America by storm. But spending taxpayer money to engage in public works projects is unconstitutional, and Harding had no intention of violating the Constitution or the people in this way. The 10th Amendment might have covered this, I mean, that could have been a state's rights if the states wanted to spend it, but he did not want to engage in this monstrosity of spending on a public road when he knew it was probably not going to be any good. Instead, he worked with Congress to lower taxes rates, which was 70%. So instead of not only getting involved and intervening into the economy, he did kind of an anti-stimulus, right? So he didn't spend any money to stimulate anything. Instead, he did the opposite. he cut taxes. The top tax rate at that time was at 70% for the top income earners. Across the board, the tax cuts were done. Lowering taxes for all gave incentive to the wealthy and businesses in the business class to invest in businesses and ideas. This set about creating an enterprising atmosphere that would see an economic expansion that had never before been imagined. This era is known as the Roaring Twenties. Started out with a 12% unemployment rate that had in 2 years fallen to a low percentage of just over 2%. This is the lowest unemployment percentage, I'd like to add, that this country has ever achieved before or since. The economic powerhouse time for this country ushered in the modern era with inventions and mass production of products such as the home dishwasher, refrigeration, first antibiotics, insulin, radio broadcasting, television broadcasting, air conditioning, the airplane, and even the zipper. During this era, there was always a new idea with the option to keep more of one's money if successful. Came the investors willing to seed the ideas, right? So, hey, if somebody sees that there's going to be a chance of it actually becoming a prosperous endeavor, they might actually, invest in it if they know that they're allowed to keep the spoils of their investment, right? Ironically, even though tax rates had been cut for all, the amount of tax revenues had increased. More people than ever were working in the United States, and they, of course, were paying taxes. So the idea that cutting taxes brings in less money to the IRS was proven all the way back in the 1920s. It is worthy to note that not only did revenues go up, but there was something different from then than it is today, which might not have happened had a Democrat been elected at that time or some other Republican. But at that time, government spending actually went down. President Harding, who was in office for more than 2.5 years, died, leaving Calvin Coolidge to become president. Coolidge was more of a hawk about government spending and taxation. He believed the government spending beyond the confines of the Constitution was immoral. He also believed that citizens had less liberty when they were forced to give more money or more of their earnings to the government, right? So a lot of times define your freedom as your ability to be economically free. Well, if you have, you can do more, obviously. You can engage in more of the pursuit of your own happiness, as the founders put it, and you have more money, when you have more capital. As a result, during the 6 years as president, the federal budget had been cut nearly in half. And there was a surplus in revenues every year, which he used to pay down the deficit. This was the last time that any administration in the United States had ever intensely focused on reducing the public debt. As previously mentioned, there have been many books and publications written on this historical impact of cutting taxes. In addition, data from government sources and studies also empirically support these claims. Authors include such renowned economists and historians as Milton Friedman, Thomas Sowell, James Grant, Walter Williams, and Burton Folsom Jr. There are a lot more than that, too. Thus, the information is indeed readily available to those who wish to actually learn from the facts. So, if people are really, truly, these people who claim to care about the little guy and everything, if they really did care about the little guy, they wouldn't be for raising taxes on anybody, trying to make the rich, quote-unquote, pay their fair share, right? They would actually, if they did the research, they would actually understand that helping the little guy actually really means, and pulling people out of poverty actually really means creating an era whereby those people can take care of themselves and see to their own capabilities, see to their own financial abilities, right? Instead of relying on, Big Brother to do it. It is widely known that most of the mainstream media are essentially one-sided when issues of the economy are discussed. It is also known that Hollywood, the media, and academia have constantly held the narrative that people in the top income brackets should be forced to pay their fair share of the tax burden in the United States. Funny how most of those people fall in the top income bracket, yet don't really pay those taxes. Well, we won't talk about that on this segment. While it is known that the top 50% of wage earners pay the entirety of all income taxes, the wealthiest at the top half are already responsible for the majority of that percentage. But history has also shown that increasing taxes on top income earners actually results in them finding ways to avoid paying them. In an interview, Thomas Sowell pointed out that when taxes are raised on the wealthy, they shift their investments to tax-exempt endeavors. In other words, they're not going to invest in something whereby their money is going to be all stolen away from them. They're going to invest it in other means. So punishing them really punishes job creation. Not having job creation punishes those who would seek to make their lives better through the acquisition of a job. This was particularly true toward the end of the 1970s. The upper class, who were avoiding the higher taxes of the day, stopped investing in job creation and sought other forms of investments that were taxed at lower rates. In essence, the rich did indeed get richer, while less job creation ensured that the poor got poorer. Imagine that. Ironically, these statements used by the left to explain what happens in trickle-down economics. In other words, what really happens in their way of doing things is what they accuse the supply side or free market economics of engaging in. It's not even true. I mean, it's crazy. In contrast, Ronald Reagan administration was able to get tax cuts across the board passed in Congress and saw not only the wealthy become more wealthy, but upward mobility was unleashed and more people moved up from the lower to middle class and the middle to upper class in terms of income than the previous decade. People in the bottom increased at a much higher and faster rate than the people at the top did with their wealth. So it's a point that they don't like to mention, but it's true. And again, you can find this in the census data. You can find this at the IRS. You can find this information. It's not hard. As previously mentioned, this necessarily equated to more people paying taxes overall, thus increasing the revenues to the IRS. Once again, you cut taxes, you actually bring in more money to the IRS, right? The truth is that there is a narrative being led by two types of people, the elites and the believers, okay? The elites are pretty much leftists, the believers are leftists, and really there's no difference in their impact on the economy and on our culture. However, the difference between them amongst themselves are very different in their intent. While much of the rhetoric against tax cuts involves the rich paying their fair share, elites themselves are a wealthy class of people. Ironically, some of them have gained their wealth in capitalism but seek to destroy the free market. Therefore, that sounds to me like a power issue, right? They want to make the money, but then they want to make sure nobody else can make it. And they're going to disguise it as being humanitarians. They see themselves as the only people on the face of this planet who know how to make the world run correct. Worthy to note that some of them didn't make their money in capitalism. Some of them made their money in politics. That's a whole different thing. The attempt to acquire power begets more attempt to acquire power. You know, you hear stories all the time of people like Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi becoming mega rich while they were in Congress and in the Senate. Bernie Sanders owns 3 properties, right? And this is a guy that is a supposed socialist who believes, you know, in the power to the people and all that nonsense. But the problem is, he's an elite, and those people who support him and think so wonderfully of him don't understand that he exempts himself from their philosophies, their actual, what he expects them to believe in. The followers are also an ironic group of people. They're often part of academia, Hollywood, mainstream media, and of course those who receive government benefits and subsidies. The reason for the irony is that many of them are college educated and should therefore be capable of critical thinking and using the scientific method to review empirical evidence. Yet many seem to lack this, as the information is readily available, but not ever sought by this group of people. It appears these followers, as many in the lower class, react solely on the basis of emotion and discard all notions of reality. It is likely that Chris Wallace's assessment of the information that he has presented, though completely arbitrary, was also based on surface observations and emotion. Most of the people who watched his broadcast likely believe the numbers, but those who know the truth likely see him as an idiot lemming, and that's exactly what he is, following the left right over a cliff. Wallace claims that tax cuts are responsible for higher debt is literally the same as saying that businesses went broke because it offered a discount that doubled its sales, right? The truth is businesses went broke for not managing its cost, and this is what the so-called educated reporter misses by accepting the ongoing narrative. Chris Wallace is not alone on the idea of what tax cuts do for the economy. which is basically nothing. In fact, this news anchor has really just echoed the same misinformation nonsense of more radical leftists. I mean, he may be a Fox News anchor, but he's really just echoing the left. For example, a woman by the name of Hannah Brooks Olson wrote in a piece in Everyday Feminism, I think it's back in July, that essentially gripes about people giving advice to people in poverty when they themselves have never been in the same financial position. And the piece is worthy of an entire video segment unto itself. I would love to just sit there and dispute every claim this woman makes, because every bit of it is based on emotion. Okay, but I really don't want to go into that. I really just want to focus on one paragraph outlines just how misinformed recent generations are. She writes, in the U.S., we have become so accepting of the fact that poverty is not just a symptom of a grossly unequal economy, red flag warning, unequal economy, or the result of numerous systemic, another red flag, failures, or the product of years of trickle-down economics. There it is, folks. But indeed, that the only thing standing between a poor person and life of their dreams is their own decision, their own choices, and their own failures. Now, her writing is not that great. I'm surprised that she even gets a piece on there, but you know, I don't think they really focus that hard on writing anymore. Trickle-down economics is the big red flag word here, or red flag statement. This is a term that the left likes to use, and to be sure, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out many times, and I think even Milton Friedman has said it a time or two, that there is no set theory called trickle-down economics. There is no economic theory called that, just a slang expression for supply-side economics or a free market economy. Okay. Anyway, the point is her, and she's not alone either. I mean, the left is riddled with this nonsense. They do not take any time to actually research any of the data. They refuse to look any of the information up. They fail to critically think, and they blame everybody and every other thing that is not them, right? Systemic. When you hear the word systemic, that means that they don't have a person's name they can blame something on. So since they can't do that, they're going to blame it on everybody in general. Okay, that isn't them. People who don't believe the way they do. Okay, systemic. Often you could say systemic means white supremacy, privilege, but really this is how they think. And a guy who works for Fox News, once prestigious, I might add. Fox News used to actually report a lot more factual information. Now, I mean, this guy is feeding directly into the left's paradigm. So, anyway, I think that it is really important for people to take the time, if they don't want to do all the research on their own, read the authors that have. The economy does need a tax cut. The economy also needs a lot less government intervention. And those are things for like Burton Folsom Jr. You can watch some of his YouTube videos. They're amazing. You will walk away from that. I mean, he writes a couple of good books. One of them is The Myth of the Robber Barons. Another one is how, FDR basically, extended the Depression. I mean, that's not the full title. It's just New Deal or Raw Deal. And he said some other part of the title, but the point is that it shows and outlines what the actual impact of the New Deal was. All of those programs and the extent of the unemployment rate as a result of those things. Possibly, in some estimates, extended the Great Depression by an additional 7 years that it didn't have to be if they didn't, intervene in the economy. Anyway, I hope I didn't bore you too much, and I hope you subscribe to my videos. My name is Jake Fogg, signing off. I'm with InternetDeputy.com, where it's not about politics, it's about freedom.